is going to talk about the Middle East in a general way. By way of introduction, I skimmed some of his recent syndicated articles, and three titles caught my eye. One, "Let the Israelis Squirm for a While." Another, "No Limits to Congressional Hypocrisy." Yet another, "With Nukes, Israelis Talk of Attacks." These reflect, I think you'll agree, controversial views. Yes, indeed. But more important, Mark is a person who questions conventional wisdom and delights in skewering sacred cows. We met in 1978. At the time, I was country director for Egyptian Affairs in the Department of State. That was the beginning of a very happy and rewarding friendship. It was only a matter of months that I was able to put out of my mind his evaluation of me in an article he wrote at the time as a company man, because I defended and advocated, as a professional Foreign Service officer should do, the administration's, in retrospect, somewhat flawed policies in the Middle East. A journalist, a consultant, editor, and author, Mark is currently chairperson of the Jewish Committee on the Middle East, an independent association of American Jews and non-Jews, which is seeking to promote a thorough reconsideration of America's, quote, special relationship, quote, with Israel. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mark Bruzonsky.
And right up front, that I'm very mad at most of you. I'm actually quite enraged and seething inside. I'm back from the Middle East 3 weeks now. It's very difficult to convey in words the emotions and the passions that are unleashing themselves in today's Middle East. This isn't a personal rage, of course. Few of us even know each other personally. It's rather a rage that has political and historic connotations, and it's a rage that is directed at our country's hypocritical and self-serving, self-righteous, and at many times imperialist policies. To be more specific, I'm mad at what the American establishment has come to represent regarding today's Middle East. And it's the Middle East, of course, that you've invited me here to speak with you about. In fact, the invitation I asked Charles a few minutes ago actually came before this crisis, but of course the crisis has created a much more emotional and a climate in which I'm sure there's much more questioning on your own part about just what our policy should be. I'm also aware that many of you here tonight haven't had a personal opportunity to really think through the crucial issues of the Middle East for yourselves. Some of you are victims of our own government's deceptions and our own press's inadequacies and timidity. Others of you have serious doubts about what our country is doing, but don't know how to oppose these policies. Still others of you, of course, maybe most of you, may be fully supportive of what our country is doing, and you may be enraged before long, if not already, with me. But whatever the case with each of you as individuals, we are all at a collective moment, a collective historic turning point in terms of American relations with the Middle East. And at such turning points, history judges us as members of nations and members of ethnic groups, not simply as individuals. Now, I could have chosen to be polite and general this evening, but very frankly, if I had, I would not be reflecting the volcanic realities of today's Middle East. And furthermore, if I had made that choice, then it seems to me the evening would likely end up being only of marginal value to you and also to me. So obviously, I've chosen a different course. I've chosen to be brutally honest, which means in the context of the contemporary situation in the Middle East, also very harsh. I have made this choice partly because I am close enough to those in the Middle East to feel their pain and their rage, but also because, in this way, this evening will certainly be provocative. Better yet, I'm hopeful you will conclude in the future that this evening was very informative and possibly even productive. Now first, before I put some real meat on these skeleton bones of rage, I think you deserve to know a bit about myself. And maybe this will help you put in perspective what I'll be saying for the next 15 or 20 minutes. I grew up in the American Midwest, Duluth, Minnesota, a proud American Jewish liberal. In fact, an Orthodox Jew, complete with Zionist summer camp, quite a fancy bar mitzvah, memories of the Holocaust around the home, and dreams of Israel. More importantly, I grew up deeply believing in the professed American values of democracy, tolerance, fairness, and justice, and not only for the citizens of our own country, but indeed for everyone. Yes, I know, in short, all of the stereotypes and myths of a typical American upbringing in the post-World War II era. At 17, I went off to Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, getting a BA in economics and government. At 21, I got a large fellowship to go to NYU Law School. And by 26, I had my law degree plus a master's in international affairs from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. During these years, I also worked for the American Zionist Youth Foundation, writing articles about Zionism, and the American Jewish Congress as their international affairs specialist. But more important than the academic degrees, through a series of accidents, I ended up representing the international student movement for the United Nations at UN headquarters in New York. And in this context, I began to get to know the real world, traveling to 35 countries, including for the first time to both the Arab world and Israel during my graduate school years. After all this schooling, I ended up in Washington, where I've been for 15 years, and where I've done a variety of things, some of which Charles mentioned to you. Most importantly, I represented the World Jewish Congress, edited a number of magazines, edited a couple of books, one for Congressional Quarterly and one for the Smithsonian, and a film strip about the Middle East for National Geographic. And as he mentioned, in recent years, I've become a weekly columnist and founded an organization called the Jewish Committee on the Middle East, which I'll tell you about at the very end. But most importantly, during these 15 years that I've been in Washington, I've been back and forth to the Middle East approximately 100 times, visiting most of the countries, meeting many of the intellectuals and political leaders firsthand. Of course, I'm trying to, in a sense, give you a sense not only of my background, but trying to build up a little credibility for the things I'm about to start saying. I've even played a little historic role twice. In October of '77, I had an opportunity to meet with Anwar Sadat and arranged for him to send the first public telegram that was ever sent from the Arab world to Israel. And then during the 1982 war, I drafted a statement which became known as the Paris Declaration, which was signed by 3 of the world's most eminent Jewish statesmen and called for a Palestinian state and negotiations with the PLO. All right, enough for the credibility building, telling you about myself. Let me tell you, as I promised I would, getting to the heart of the matter, why I'm so mad and why people like myself are so enraged at what's taking place today and what's been taking place for some years. In a forum like this one, I can only do this by way of general conclusions and principles. I can't compress nearly 2 decades of experience with the Middle East into a few minutes in any other way. The reason I'm so mad is that our government, our representative government, continues year after year to pursue hypocritical, duplicitous, and sometimes downright immoral and indecent policies throughout the Middle East. In short, our monies, our energies, our influence seem all designed to keep the peoples of the Middle East in the chains created by European imperialism earlier in this century. In many ways, most of the Middle East today remains colonized, not as in the old days with colonial administrators, but by far more modern techniques fostered by our American empire. And we citizens seem not only to like it that way, but we urge our government to keep it that way. In short, our attempt to keep the Middle East, quote, stable, unquote, a word we so often hear in our press and from our politicians, is little more than a way to rhetorically sanitize our national obsession with keeping the entire region hostage to our own short-term greed and self-serving desires. The Middle East today actually needs, at the very least, progressive evolutionary changes, in many cases revolutionary changes. The Arab and Muslim worlds desperately need their own forms of glasnost and perestroika. But the great American empire, working in tandem with a variety of repressive and unpopular regimes, seems to nip all such developments in the bud. In short, we are in bed with many of the most undemocratic regimes. We provide the financial, military, and intelligence assistance which keeps these regimes in power. And we then use these regimes to do our own bidding. In short, we provide the covert capabilities to undermine truly democratic and popular challenges to these regimes. In short, while we Americans are constantly perpetrating the myth of serious American concern for and interest in the peoples of the Middle East, the brutal reality is that our actual policies are almost always specifically designed to perpetrate the Middle East's inequities and divisions, all for our own benefit. And most of all, in short again, we provide the increasingly repressive, yes, the nearly fascist government in contemporary Israel, with the means and support to continue to massacre and beat into submission the courageous Palestinian people who I've come to know in the past 2 decades. As a result of all these policies carried out for many years now, we are today witnessing a Middle East seething in turmoil and hatred. We are witness to a Middle East turning fanatically toward a resurgence of Islamic fanaticism and tribal instincts. We are witness to a Middle East where Americans and other Westerners are increasingly targeted as hostages. And we are witness to a Middle East threatening to erupt with anti-American passions and anti-Western revolutions. And what is our response? No sooner did the Cold War come to an end, but we seized the very first opportunity to get our troops in place to keep the region stable. First, we said we were going to send some tens of thousands of troops to protect Saudi Arabia from an invasion that not only never came, but was largely illusory from the beginning. Now it turns out that we have actually sent hundreds of thousands of troops whose stated mission somehow has become to restore a feudal monarchy in Kuwait, but whose actual mission is to control and dominate the entire region by money, force, and intimidation. Worse yet, but sadly true to our national character these days, every time someone mentions a possible political deal that takes everyone's interests, including Iraq's, into consideration, our bellicose president screams about Hitler and shouts that no compromise of any kind is possible. And worst of all, we now have a presidency that is actually subverting our very Constitution by clearly preparing for a major war, yet refusing to bring the matter before the Congress as the Constitution demands. If ever there were a case in modern history when the people's consent was imperative and timely, it is this situation today. Yet our Congress seems paralyzed, and our president imperial on these most crucial matters of war and peace. And when it comes to Israel, the small country with which we have the closest connection of any country in the world, we continue to send money and arms in ever-growing amounts, making a mockery of nearly everything we say we stand for. We say we stand for human rights, but our actions, rather than our words, show that we don't give a damn about the rights of the Palestinians, even at a time when torture, pogroms, and periodic massacres are common Israeli practices. We enlist the support of the Security Council on matters that concern us, such as the Gulf situation, yet we much more than tolerate our best allies' defiance of the United Nations. We cover Israel's back and we supply more guns and more money. We say we insist on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and we even threaten strategic countries like Pakistan with an aid cutoff. Yet we look the other way when our primary ally in world affairs, Israel, is largely responsible for creating a massive mass destruction arms race throughout the Middle East. I could go on and on. All this said, I was tempted when putting these thoughts together during the past few days to lighten up at this point. Maybe even look for a joke about Middle East affairs. But very, very frankly, I don't have any suitable jokes. And even if I did, I couldn't and wouldn't tell them under the current desperate circumstances. Besides that, I actually don't want to lighten things up. Rather, I specifically want to help you feel how tense the situation in the Middle East has become, how great and still growing the hatreds and the fears are. And I've chosen to do that by reading you two poems. Up until a year ago, I had never read a poem while giving a talk. But frankly, with the situation deteriorating in the way that it has, these poems have more power than more words. So, with your indulgence, I'll read you two poems, both by Israelis. And then I have a little story about a little 3-year-old Palestinian girl. The first poem is written by a man who everybody in Israel knows. In fact, until a year and a half ago, he was the master of ceremonies on Israeli National Day on television. He was the man who the Israeli army hired to choreograph Israeli National Day. He was the man who introduced the chief of staff and the prime minister, and the man the country looked to as sort of the master of ceremonies. And then he got up almost 2 years ago at a peace rally, and he read the following poem. Obviously, he's no longer doing the things that he was doing before, but he's a man of considerable talent, a very famous playwright and television personality, and his poem is titled, "We Shoot Children Too, Don't We?" Most of these people truly desire to harvest their olive trees as they have for hundreds of years. Most of these people truly desire to raise their kids, not to throw stones or Molotov cocktails, but to study in peace, to play in peace, and raise a flag, their own flag, and facing that flag to cry, as we did that night, then excited as we were. And we have no right in the world to rob them of this desire, this flag, these tears which always come after all the others. Let us start preparing our defense. We will need it soon enough. Those who actually did it, and those who still do, and those who have hushed it up, and those who still do, and those who said nothing, and those who clucked their tongue, saying, "Something must be done, really, but not tonight. I have a concert, a gala event, a birthday." Indeed, we'll all get our summons one day for the colonel's trials. The colonel's trials are coming. Their time will come, it must be so. The trials of the generals, the colonels, and the division, the battalion, and the platoon commanders. There is no escaping it. This is how history works. What shall we say then? What will the colonels, the captains, the corporals say? What will they say of those terrible beatings, the brutality of houses blown up, and most of all, the humiliation, that humiliation of patients forced to wipe off the writing on the walls, of old men forced to take down a flag from an electric pole, who got electrocuted or fell and broke their legs, of the old water carrier whom soldiers ordered off his donkey and rode on his back just for fun. We turned a deaf ear, we turned a deaf heart, mean, arrogant, and dumb. Who do we think we are to be so deaf, so dumb? Ignoring the obvious. They are as human as we are, at least as we used to be only 41 years ago. No less diligent, no less smart, as sensitive as full of hope. They love their wives and children as we do, no less. And our children now shoot theirs with lead, plastic bullets, and gas. The Palestinian state will come to pass, it will. Not a poet wrote this, history will. And seasons will come and seasons will go, and life goes on, as we very well know. Weddings and birth and death all the same, but just the shame of it, the shame. Dare to cry out. Lie still for a moment and listen to their cries, to the crackling of flames, the burning tires and trees, and the crackling of bones, as blindfolded they are led away to illegal living deaths. Seems you've left them no choice, closing to them all mode of expression, yet they still have the power, even with arms tied behind their backs, to rebel against 20 years of oppression. They still have the strength to dream and to fight for that dream, just as we fought for ours 40 years back. Why can't you see yourselves in their determined 12-year-old faces? You hated your oppressor. Why shouldn't they hate theirs? And how many of them will you kill and beat senseless before you realize that what you're fighting so stubbornly will happen anyway, with your blessing or without? Now arise, but careful not to make too many waves, careful not to drown us in our God-forsaken lethargy, careful not to shake us out of our delicate fantasy world, where it's so easy to keep the blinders on and continue as if nothing's changed. You risk reminding us that our sons are turning into brutal beasts just 9 kilometers away. You might remind us of what we meant this country to be. Seems a long-forgotten dream now, abandoned by the side of the road, fatally wounded and reeling. A couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, a number of us got together and decided that we needed to speak up boldly in this society against not only the policies of the United States, but the policies of Israel as well. We organized ourselves into a group called the Jewish Committee on the Middle East. You all have on your seats as you sat down our latest leaflet, which tells you who's on the advisory committee and something about the organization. But before taking your questions, I'd like just to tell you a little personal story about why I came back to this country in December of '87 and decided we had to set up this organization, actually an organization that many of us had been talking about since the 1982 war. I was traveling on one of these wonderful little Pan Am 30-day world passes in December of 1987. I had earned it many years before, and I'd never had 30 days in which to enjoy it. But December of '87, Pan Am threatened that if you didn't use it, you lost it. So I arranged to take December of '87, and my plan was to go everywhere Pan Am went except the Middle East. I'd already been everywhere in the Middle East. But of course the Intifada broke out on the 8th of December 1987, and by the last week, by Christmas time, I realized that in a few days I wasn't going to go to the airport, show the pass, and get on any plane I wanted to. So I told a number of Palestinians that the time had come for me to go live in a refugee camp and see for myself what was going on. It's not that I hadn't been to refugee camps. I've been to many refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, Palestine. And I didn't realize what a difference it made to go and stay. I expected a quantitative experience, not a qualitative experience. But anyway, 24 hours later, I was in a place called Dheisheh, which is a camp of 10,000 people, surrounded by barbed wire and the Israeli army. Quite reminiscent, frankly, of concentration camps. And for 3 days, I stayed there. And the last night, I was ready to come back to Washington. I was asked to come to dinner in Bethlehem with a family, people who lived in the camp, but one of the sons had moved out and had an apartment in Bethlehem 2 miles away. And when I got there, I was introduced to his family. 3 adorable young girls, the youngest of whom was 3 years old, and her name was Lena. And Lena was, of course, well, Lena was the hit of the evening. She saw my video camera. She was told I was a journalist from America. The red light on the camera went on, and Lena told every song and danced every dance and said everything she had to say and never stopped. But 45 minutes into this evening, Lena's father asked her to come over, and he explained to Lena that Mark was an American Jew and that he was a friend of the family. And I watched what happened to the little girl. She sort of stopped in her tracks. She hadn't been quiet for more than 2 seconds since I met her almost an hour before. She literally stopped in her tracks, and she stared at me, and she stared at her father. And she said, of course this was being translated for me, she said, "No, you're kidding. Mark's a friend, he's not a Jew." And her father said, "No, Lena, you need to understand that not all Jews are bad, and Mark is a friend, and there are other Jews who are friends." And it's as if she tried in her 3-year-old brain to find some associations. She was, again, stopped in her tracks, and she was looking for some way to understand this. The idea that there could be a good Jew, the idea that there could be a friend, the idea that he could come for dinner and I like him. She couldn't. There wasn't anything in her experience to that age that made it possible for her to believe what she had, the shock that she had just been subjected to. So she came over to me and stared at me, this little 3-year-old girl. And then she started hitting me. And she ordered that the camera be turned off. She had ordered it be turned on all the time before. And she ordered that I get out of the house, that I had that she had said, she, the 3-year-old, the smallest one in the family, she had said everything that she was going to say to me, and I should leave now. All right, it's a story. There are other stories. There are Israeli children and Jewish children who are being brutalized and who have probably similar stories about Arabs and Palestinians. But for me, it was sort of the culmination of many, many, many experiences, and I saw the future in Lena's eyes. I saw a future in which this kind of hatred and this kind of fear was beginning to take over all of us. Anyway, I came back a few days later, and since then, a small group of American Jews has become a more sizable group of American Jews. We're not exactly unknown people. We're not people that don't have some status and reputation. We have on our advisory committee professors of Middle East Studies at Harvard, at Columbia, at Stanford, at Princeton, the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I represented, as I told you, for 8 years the World Jewish Congress. Professor Yigal Ahrens is actually the defense minister of Israel's son. We have a number of rabbis, and actually we have Jewish professors at over 140 universities around the country who have begun to speak up. And we're not just speaking up saying we'd like to see a small change. We're speaking up saying we'd like to see a very big change. We don't think the special relationship with Israel makes any sense anymore. We don't think our country should be providing the guns and the money for policies that are outrageous and immoral. We think that it's time the United States started putting policies in place that are consistent with our values and our statements. But I'm not going to propagandize you anymore about the Jewish Committee on the Middle East. We do want to have your involvement and your support if you think what we're doing is important. More importantly, I just wanted to give you a sense, and I realized it had to be done in a general, all-encompassing way. I wanted to give you a sense that what's going on in the Middle East today is really a historic turning point. What takes place in 1990 may well set the stage for what will take place in the Middle East and what will take place in U.S. Middle East relations for the rest of our lifetimes. What our government is telling us is not the truth. It doesn't take any genius to look at statements that have been made the first week of August, second week of August, the third week of August. It doesn't take any genius to see the inconsistencies. We are clearly being led down a path toward war, and we're being led down that path for certain reasons. Now, I'd like to spend the rest of the time this evening, it's always most informative, I think, to engage in questions and answers, but was that the barbed wire and the soldiers were reminiscent of concentration camps. I did not say they were reminiscent of gas chambers, so you set up a straw man, and there's nothing more I need to say about that. As far as the policies that I would advocate, I think at minimum, the Israeli government should be sitting down with the recognized leaders of the Palestinian community. Everybody in the world recognizes them as the leaders of the Palestinian community. They're called the PLO. At minimum, the Israeli government should be sitting down and negotiating to see whether or not a political settlement of this problem is possible. In fact, it strikes me as outrageous that for approximately 20 years, the Israeli government was insisting that before such negotiations could take place, they expected the leader of the PLO to recognize the existence of Israel. And for quite literally a decade, Charles was in the Foreign Service throughout this period. I'm sure he remembers it. Then, in fact, when against the advice of much of his own constituency, the leader of the PLO took that step and called Israel's bluff, we found out that that wasn't the problem in actuality all along. The real problem is that the government of Israel does not want to make a political settlement of any kind with Palestinian nationalism, since the PLO represents Palestinian nationalism, and in fact, just about every Palestinian I know supports both Palestinian nationalism and the PLO. The Israeli government doesn't want to involve itself in negotiations because any compromise that would be reached would have to recognize Palestinian nationalism. The problem all along was not that the Israeli government needed the Palestinians to recognize them, it was that the Palestinians needed the Israelis to recognize them.
All right, let's have another question.
A meeting in the desert in 1922 where a British colonial administrator drew a few lines, and the minutes of that meeting and the minutes of those policies at that time make it very clear that the British were completely aware that they were weakening Iraq by not drawing the lines in such a way that Iraq would have good access to the Gulf. So a political deal is possible if we want it, but I'm afraid we don't want it. I think the statements and actions of our President and Secretary of Defense, in fact, what is the reaction? As I drove up here this afternoon, the reaction to the peace feelers is our Defense Secretary says we need to send 100,000 more troops to the Gulf. The United States, in my judgment, is planning to stay in the Middle East. We've wanted to put troops in for a long time. The Cold War was the primary barrier to that because the Russians simply had told us they weren't going to stand for that. The Cold War is gone. The Russian Empire is coming apart. We've sent troops there under the ruse that we were going to defend against an invasion of Saudi Arabia. And now we're trying desperately to find excuses and reasons why we can keep them there even if a political settlement is possible. To be even more specific, I would make the political deal. I would indicate that we are prepared to withdraw all American forces from the region, and that in fact we think it's a good idea that the other major problems of the region be addressed as well. We don't